A new crisis for Newsnight. Tonight, this programme apologises. A key allegation in a report about child abuse was wrong. The abuse victim says he was mistaken.
Humble apologies to Lord McAlpine. That certainly is not the man that abused me. That's certainly not the man I identified as abused me to North Wales Police in the 90s.
The senior Conservative named on the internet steps forward to tackle the slurs and instructs his lawyer to set the record straight.
We need to take a number of different actions. First thing is trying to get this taken down from the internet, which is not going to be easy. And then we have to look at Newsnight.
This MP wonders what on earth Newsnight was playing at. And these experts will tell us where it all leaves the BBC and the thousands of abuse victims who were already terrified of speaking up. Also tonight, the Treasury has found a load of cash down the back of the sofa. Rather than all going on a bender, we'll be paying down the deficit. We ask if there's any more back there. And ash dieback, the continental tree killer, is here to stay and can't be eradicated, the government says. Is this the end of the English ash? We start tonight with a statement issued in the last hour by Newsnight and the BBC.
On the 2nd of November, Newsnight broadcast a report that looked into criticism of the North Wales Abuse Tribunal. The report included an interview with Steve Measham, an abuse victim who said that a senior political figure of the time had abused him. We broadcast Mr. Measham's claim, but did not identify the individual concerned. Mr. Measham has tonight made a statement that makes clear he wrongly identified his abuser and has apologised. We also apologise unreservedly for having broadcast this report.
This time last week here on Newsnight, Steve Measham, who was repeatedly abused as a child in North Wales, said one of his abusers was a senior politician of the Thatcher era. There wasn't enough information for Newsnight to name the individual. But on the internet, where the standard of proof is zero, there was no shortage of names. The Prime Minister had a list of them waved in his face on live television. Today, one of the names had enough. Lord McAlpine went public to denounce false and seriously defamatory allegations. And tonight, Steve Measham has changed his story and apologised, and so has the BBC. Here's Jim Reid.
He was at the heart of the Thatcher government, a fixer who served as both deputy chairman and treasurer. Today, he issued a strongly worded statement denying he's the man at the centre of abuse allegations. In the statement, which runs to more than 1,000 words, Lord McAlpine said, "I have never been to the children's home in Wrexham, nor have I ever visited any children's home. I have never stayed in a hotel in or near Wrexham. I did not own a Rolls-Royce, have never had a gold card or Harrods card, and never wear aftershave, all of which has been alleged. I did not sexually abuse residents." Lord McAlpine has been at the centre of a storm of internet gossip triggered by a report on Newsnight last week.
These are allegations of a paedophile ring involving people from all walks of life. Businessmen, a market trader, a senior public figure.
In the report, a former care home resident, Steve Measham, claimed he'd been abused by a senior political figure from the Thatcher era. There is no doubt Mr. Measham was a victim of serial sexual abuse at the Bryniston home. The allegations were taken so seriously by the government that he met the Welsh Secretary this week to discuss the case. The journalists working on the Newsnight reports did not show a photograph of Lord McAlpine to Mr. Measham. When he finally saw one this evening, he said he was not the man who abused him.
First, I'd just like to offer my sincere and humble apologies to Lord McAlpine. That certainly is not the man that abused me. That's certainly not the man I identified as abused me to North Wales Police in the 90s. And that's certainly not the man that was on that photograph. I spoke out within the first 5 minutes of seeing a picture of him. I was on the phone straight away and issued an apology straight away. I was actually mortified. I really did feel for the man and his family. This should never have happened.
But Lord McAlpine's lawyers said the peer's reputation is in tatters after a week of allegations and unfair chatter on blogs and internet sites.
He's broken-hearted over this. His family are very upset. And he feels that, bearing in mind his health isn't that good, that this is a total shock to receive at his time in life.
Newsnight did not name Lord McAlpine in its report, and because of that, he was not approached for a response. But rumours of his involvement quickly took off on Twitter, Facebook and other social networking sites. At the heart of all this is the way in which sites like Twitter work. If you looked up a comment or post about Newsnight this week, you would have seen a list of related search terms, including, like here, paedophile and McAlpine.
I saw when I put on Twitter on the Friday afternoon that the thing was ablaze, and there was a hashtag Newsnight, and that seemed to be leading to the names of certain politicians. Now that's the sort of thing that Twitter does. There isn't really an old media equivalent to that. The only equivalent I can think of is occasionally when people in newspapers used to write a story about somebody without naming them, they might put a picture of them nearby. But in the new media world, the data processing going on inside Twitter is making connections, and it's not too difficult to work out what those connections are.
I have those names there.
It's assumed Lord McAlpine's name was on a list of former politicians handed to David Cameron on live TV by the presenter Philip Schofield.
Now, as I say, if anyone has any information about anyone who's a paedophile... about
Number 10 dismissed that today as a silly stunt and warned against trial by Twitter.
We do have to be very careful before casting aspersions against individuals or bandying people's names around, as was being done yesterday, without proper evidence. And I think every institution, every journalist, every politician has to think carefully about those things.
Lord McAlpine's solicitor says the peer now has no choice but to take legal action over the claims.
We need to take a number of different actions. First thing is trying to get this taken down from the internet, which is not going to be easy. And then we have to look at Newsnight and the way in which they behaved and the way they trailed it. They made it obvious who it was.
Newsnight was heavily criticised for its handling of the Jimmy Savile scandal. An internal BBC investigation is underway into the decision to drop its reports last year into sexual abuse by the star. Now the programme and the BBC is under fire again, this time for a decision to run a report based on information which later turned out to be false. In the last hour, the corporation has issued a statement saying it apologises unreservedly for broadcasting that report.
Some of us said when this very story first came out, victims must have their say, they must have their day, if you like. And now we've had a victim who I'm sure was just genuinely mistaken. Maybe somebody gave him the wrong information a long time ago. It just makes the whole issue even more complicated.
There are still many unanswered questions about the abuse scandal in North Wales and the Waterhouse investigation. What about the names of other alleged abusers linked to the children's home but never charged? And what about the victims who say they were told to keep quiet and not to give evidence? New allegations are still emerging. One man contacted the BBC to say he was drugged, taken away in an expensive car and raped. He never gave evidence to the inquiry.
If I mentioned it in years to come, if I said anything, he would send the same people to come and get me and my family, and I would never see them again, because he had friends in really high places.
The government said tonight that it will still go ahead with a series of inquiries into the Welsh care home scandal, but there will also be wider questions asked about anonymity for people accused of these crimes and the role of both established media and the internet in publicising and spreading those names.
Obviously, we wanted to ask questions of the BBC, but no one was available for interview. The Conservative MP Rob Wilson has been a concerned critic of the BBC's handling of Jimmy Savile's time at the BBC, also how the BBC has behaved in recent weeks. And now this, Mr Wilson, how bad can it get?
Well, it's pretty bad, isn't it? I mean, this apology tonight, which I welcome, it needs to go much further, really, because we've got a situation now where last Friday, Newsnight broadcast an item which triggered a huge wave of innuendo and smears across the internet and across Twitter, and it really did bring into disrepute the journalism, really, because the report was not fair and it wasn't responsible. And I think that in terms of Ofcom's code of broadcasting conduct, I think it would certainly be an infringement of that. it was a pretty shoddy piece of journalism and very surprising for the BBC.
And its effects may be quite wide-ranging. I've got some news from the Director General himself, who's ordered several actions. I don't know if you're aware of this. A senior news executive has been sent in to supervise tonight's edition of Newsnight, and I can verify that. I've met her. An apology will be carried in full on Newsnight. Tick that. Ken Macquarie, Director of BBC Scotland, will write an urgent report for the DG covering what happened on the Newsnight investigation we're talking about. And perhaps significantly, and I want your response to these last 2 points, there will be an immediate pause in all Newsnight investigations to assess editorial robustness and supervision, and there will be an immediate suspension of all co-productions with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism across the BBC. I don't know, can you hear the stable door closing?
I'm sorry, I can't hear a lot of what you're saying.
Oh,
but
great. Now even the sound isn't working.
The sound isn't working at my end or your end?
The journalism isn't working. Essentially, the BBC is going to pause all Newsnight investigations.
Yeah. OK. Well, I think that the good thing about this is at least the BBC is trying to act decisively. Over the Savile incident, it was very slow, dragged its feet and really took a long time to catch up. At least this time it seems to be acting fairly swiftly. And I do welcome some of the actions it seems to be taking, although I haven't seen the full detail because it's only come in yet. We do have to have a thorough look at why this happened, because the editorial process within Newsnight has clearly gone badly wrong. And it's gone badly wrong before over Savile, so there's clearly a pattern within this. And there are lots of theories about why this particular one got aired in the first place. There's one theory that it was an overcompensation for what happened with Savile, but there is also a theory out there that this was a diversionary tactics to divert attention away from the BBC. So I think if Ken Macquarie is looking at this, I think he has to look at those issues as well.
Is Newsnight toast?
Newsnight has a proud tradition of excellent journalism, and I would not like at this stage, without seeing the detail of any investigation that's about to take place. I don't want to just have a knee-jerk reaction to what's been going on. I want to have the information and the evidence in front of me and take a considered view of whether Newsnight should continue or not.
Rob Wilson, thank you. What effect will all of this have on the BBC and on the people who were abused as children, people who were already reluctant to speak out? Professor Richard Wortley is director of the Jill Dando Institute for Security and Crime Science. Esther Ranson founded Childline. She knows her way around the BBC journalism too. And Steve Hewlett is presenter of Radio 4's The Media Show. Steve, how would you characterise this latest Newsnight fiasco?
It's a disaster, little short of it, to be honest. Just weeks ago, Newsnight is flayed alive for not having broadcast something which it now appears was probably true. And now it's being flayed alive for broadcasting something which we now know was certainly not true. The question here is, I don't think it's about good or bad faith. I assume good faith on the part of all the people involved in the investigation and the broadcast. But we expect from Newsnight, we need to have from Newsnight and the BBC, not so much good faith, but we like that, but as good journalism. And in this case, we know for sure the BBC had investigated this Steve Measham and his allegations on at least 2 separate occasions and found them wanting. If you go back to the original Waterhouse report, you'll see references to him or to his evidence described as bordering on fantasy. Now, it would have taken 2 or 3 phone calls to establish not that there's anything wrong with this gentleman. Look, he was seriously abused and one can have nothing but genuine sympathy for him, but that his story about Lord McAlpine was simply groundless.
What about,
and it would have taken 2 phone calls to find it out.
What about the BBC's defence that because Lord McAlpine wasn't named in the report, that's different?
I think that's preposterous. If they know it's Lord McAlpine, and remember, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism tweeted earlier in the day, last Friday, implying, at least they later apologised, they didn't mean it, but nevertheless, implying that the person would be named. Now, there's no doubt that everybody involved in this knew that the person he was referring to was Lord McAlpine. Now, strictly speaking, of course, there's no requirement to get an answer from Lord McAlpine because you're not accusing him of anything. But not to have contacted him to check the allegations seems, when you know that's who he's talking about, is absurd. And if I may make one other point, it's all very well to talk about trial by Twitter. In actual fact, this was trial by Newsnight. Newsnight turned itself into the internet. I mean, the point is, it's not Twitter that broadcasts this, it's not the internet that broadcasts this, it's the BBC's top nightly current affairs show. And that's why, on the back of everything else that's happened, it is little short of a disaster. And what people out there are asking is, who is running this show? And I don't just mean this show, I mean this show.
Esther Ranson, you're shaking your head through much of that.
Well, I feel as if I've lived through a bit of this myself, in a sense, because some years back on That's Life, we investigated a boys' school, boarding school, which was owned by a multimillionaire paedophile who employed 3 paedophile teachers. And I can say that quite safely because they all went to jail for it. But we, A, took 6 months over that investigation, and B, did so with a barrister and the BBC House lawyers checking every single stage of our investigation and telling us, not asking us to drop it, as Newsnight was asked to drop the Savile investigation, but saying you need more evidence. You still need more evidence. The boys themselves had to sign affidavits. The barrister tested them to see if their evidence would stand up in court, whether they'd be good witnesses. When you make this kind of terribly serious allegation, the lawyers have to be part of your team. I don't know where they were with Newsnight, either when they dropped the Savile thing or when they broadcast the other.
In a sense, in journalistic terms, this is almost a bigger clanger, actually, than the Savile question. I mean, in the Savile case...
Newsnight's outdone itself.
Well, it's outdone itself in terms of a journalistic failure, because at least in the Savile case, you can imagine reasons why the editor might have been nervous about the story, and I'm not going to go into all the detail, but as a former editor myself, I can imagine that he may have felt, this isn't right, it's not quite ready yet. Why they didn't press on is another question. Yeah. But at least in that case, you can sort of see there are reasons why, reasons for uncertainty. In this case, 2 or 3 phone calls should have established that this man's story was not to be taken at face value.
Richard Wortley, let me bring you in here, because it's worth saying, isn't it, that while all of our focus, a lot of the media's focus in recent weeks has been on celebrities and alleged paedophile rings, for most children who are abused, if that's our primary concern, they're not being abused by celebrities, are they?
No, not at all. As serious as those cases are, we know that about 95% of child sex abuse occurs between perpetrators and victims who know each other, have pre-existing relationships. About 60%, in fact, occur within the home, and the other 35 or so between friends or friends of the family or other acquaintances. So it's very much the tail of the dog.
And those children will already have great difficulty in thinking about speaking out. I wonder what effect you think all of this will have on them.
Well, I don't think it will help them speak out, but I think the reasons that they don't speak out are very complex. It's not just fear. It can be fear, it can be concerns that they won't be believed. In many cases, it's the fact that they are in a pre-existing authority relationship with the perpetrator. Often they don't understand they've been abused, or they can't separate out the abuse from normal parenting or normal authority kinds of activities. For example, they may be abused while being bathed, and it can be difficult. They can also have feelings of loyalty towards the abuser. In fact, many cases, if the abuser is a parent or a guardian, they love the guardian.
And so in those circumstances, Esther Ranson, what are those children supposed to do when they've seen all the Savile stuff with children apparently being ignored, and now they've seen a man who was certainly abused over a number of years in North Wales getting involved in this media kerfuffle?
Any child is being abused now, whoever the abuse is by, and I've had a child ringing Childline say, explain why she couldn't tell us where she was, because she said, I've got 2 daddies. I've got Lovely Daddy and Monster Daddy. If I tell you where I am, you'll take Monster Daddy away and I'll lose Lovely Daddy as well, which is exactly what Richard was talking about. But they must speak out. What we do at Childline is we encourage them to speak to a trusted adult, because that way we can stop the abuse. If it's mum, if it's grandmother, if it's the parent of a friend, we can stop the abuse. But what really concerns me is that abuser doesn't go to trial. And what worries me most about all these stories is that the reason the original disclosures about Savile didn't go to trial is that our adversarial court process militates so ferociously against a child. A barrister said to me, a defence barrister said to me, I don't care how great a monster my client is or what it takes to break down a child. It's my job to do it, and I will. And as long as we continue to use our adversarial process to break down children, these disclosures will not come to court.
Steve Hewlett, just finally on the journalism, this news that investigations are being suspended on Newsnight. I mean, you do wonder then, what's the point of it? I mean, you'd just be left with the papers, wouldn't you?
Well, I mean, look, sort of. I mean, Newsnight's stock in trade is discussion of topical issues. It has always had a tradition of doing film pieces, but most of them are not, in that sense, investigations. Look, it may be the BBC will decide that if it's going to do investigations, it should be File on 4 on the radio and Panorama on TV, and you accumulate all the skills necessary to do it there. Because one of the things I think that the review into the original Savile discussion will no doubt come across is the sense in which, notwithstanding good faith all round, it was pretty mismanaged. Handling investigative journalists from an editor's point of view is never easy.
And trust in the BBC is in the toilet.
Well, listen, there's a piece of work from Cantor, who do the BBC's own work for them, this week, which showed that 76% of people asked did not trust senior BBC executives to tell the truth. That is a genuine shocker. On top of which, some Comres research, which has always shown, in answer to the question, do you trust the BBC? 60% yes, 30% no. 2009, 65%, 35%. This time, 45% yes, 47% no. First time those figures have reversed.
Esther Ranson, very briefly, on trust in the BBC.
I completely trust the BBC. Only the BBC would call us together in a studio and say, mea culpa in this way. I think the BBC learns harsh lessons, does learn from them, and goes on and makes fantastically important programmes.
I've never known it like this.
All right, listen, thank you all very much. Now, here's something you don't hear every day. The Treasury has found some money down the back of the sofa. It's quite a lot of money. Not enough to let the good times roll, but enough to get Joe Lynham into the studio. Joe, thanks for doing this. This money wasn't obviously really found on the back of a sofa, was it?
Not really, no. I think we should start with the printing presses, because that's where it all starts. In order to stoke up the economy, the Bank of England was charged with creating money through quantitative easing, and it created £375 billion over the last few years. What it's done is it bought government bonds from banks and pension funds and insurance companies and all that kind of stuff with this new money. Now, attached to those government bonds is something called a coupon, which is an interest rate, an annual payment, as it were.
Could you not do with a nice graphic to illustrate all of this? Have they closed the graphics department down?
The cash pile has been diminished so much in other investigations.
Okay, you're doing very well just with words. Go on.
That I don't have the money. Now, the coupon basically has to be repaid, because it's a government bond, by the government. And here's the funny bit. The Treasury, or the government, has to borrow from the Bank of England in order to repay this coupon. Now, the difference between what it borrows for, which is half of 1%, the current bank rate, and what it has to pay the coupon, or the interest rate, to the bonds, is around 2%. And that has built up what's called a cash pile or a profit. Now, what's happening now is that cash pile will no longer necessarily just sit there in the Bank of England. The Treasury will continue to pay the coupon, but it'll get a rebate every quarter, and that's where the figures are kind of massaged, as it were, because it will help reduce the debt pile in the short term. It won't reduce the debt pile, but it will reduce it in the short term.
So what can George Osborne do with this?
Well, potentially very little, because the only thing he can necessarily do is when he stands up to make his autumn statement in 3 weeks' time, he can say that my target of bending the debt curve downwards,
that would have been a great graphic.
That would have been a great graphic.
Lovely.
Is now on target. Whereas had he not found £35 billion, which is what we're talking about here, he might not necessarily have been able to say that. Labour have been saying it's all smoke and mirrors, and us jaundiced journalists are saying that yes, why are they doing this now just before the autumn statement? The government says this is very transparent, and we're coming into line with the Japanese and the Americans in our process. But let's just wait and see what the Office for National Statistics say and the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility.
Joe, thank you. The disease that came from the continent and is killing our ash trees is here to stay, according to England's Environment Secretary. They will try to slow it down, they will try to reduce its impact, but the official view is it's not going away. And Newsnight's Susan Watt has been learning that ash trees may not be the only ones under threat.
It's not just our ash trees that face an uncertain future. Scientists say trees throughout our forests, woodlands and cities face a threat from diseases and pests that's unprecedented in recent history. Today's focus has been on minimising the impact of the ash crisis. But that's just the latest in a wave of infections that threatens our trees. And the government's being told very firmly by scientists that if it doesn't get this right, then other species are at risk. The plane tree could be next.
We're facing a major threat from this particular pathogen, which has been in Italy for many years, but is now spreading quite rapidly through the plane trees in many parts of Europe, and it's moving northwards in France quite rapidly too, so heading our way in the near future.
Over the past 40 years, the UK has seen tree infections and pests come to light at an increasing rate. Back in 1971, it was Dutch elm disease. Flash forward to the past decade and the rate of infection has picked up, with a new disease or pest almost every year. The oak processionary moth appeared in 2006, disease in larch trees in 2009, acute oak decline in 2010. This year, disease struck juniper and chestnut trees, before ash dieback became news.
We're certainly facing a massive threat from potentially damaging agents coming into Britain. Maybe some via Europe, maybe some directly into Britain. And it has accelerated enormously in the last 10 to 20 years. The reason for that is almost certainly global trade in living plant material. Obviously we've done that for many years, but the scale of it now is absolutely vast. It's very difficult to even conceive of the number of plants that are coming into Europe every year from all over the world.
The Environment Secretary said today he's taken on board the scale of the threat and will spend more money to address it, though he warned that other areas of his department's budget will be cut as a result. The UK's largest woodland conservation charity has been calling on the government to do more.
I think the government is on the right lines, but I think there's a lot more it could do. Owen Paterson was talking this morning about a radical look at things. He was talking about more resources. We really need to see the colour of the money on that. We certainly need to look really, really clearly at how plants come into the country, the controls that they need to go through before they're imported, so that we don't inadvertently bring in diseases that are on continental imports.
Others warned this week there's a risk of us dropping the ball on tree health because expertise in our universities has run down in the past 20 years.
We need a standing team of people who have the knowledge and experience built up over years and continuous among them to respond to unexpected things that happen. The analogy is with a fire brigade. You keep them there for when you have a fire. You don't sack them because you haven't had a fire for a year.
The government said today that on ash, they're not going to chop down mature trees, but try to spot the ones that are resistant and build up a national stock from those. They also want a radical rethink on the way we protect our forests, and they've asked a task force of scientists to come up with the best way to do that. Stephen Woodward is one of 10 scientists on that task force, and he's already clear what he wants the government to do to protect our plane trees.
I would suggest an immediate ban on the import of plane trees and any materials that might carry the pathogen into the UK. In the longer term, I would suggest that we need to develop quarantine facilities so that we can hold any plant materials, trees and so on in a secure facility for some considerable length of time before it's actually allowed into the marketplace in the UK.
We asked the government's key advisor on plant health if that's a good idea.
Well, I think we need to look again all of the risks on the horizon. Clearly, cholera has caught us by surprise, in a sense, the speed with which it's moved, and that applies right across Europe. And certainly in the case of plane trees, we already have regulation in place. It's already one of the 250 organisms listed in the EU's plant health rules, so there are measures already there, which of course wasn't the case for cholera.
On ash, there is at least some breathing space over winter when infection slows. Valuable time for the government to make sure that the impact of this infection is minimised and that it looks beyond the immediate crisis to prevent the devastation of other UK trees.
Review is up next. Joe Wiley's in Glasgow. What do you have, Joe?
There's been a rock and roll vibe to the review show Soundcheck tonight as we prepare to tackle books about three legends from the 60s, John Lennon, Pete Townsend and Mick Jagger. We're marking the 125th anniversary of the record label Columbia, home to Dylan and Springsteen, and looking at a documentary that claims to reveal the truth about the secret disco revolution. All that and music from former Stranglers frontman Hugh Cornwell. Join me, Paul Morley, Kate Mossman and Ricky Ross in just a moment.
Let's have a quick look at the paper's front pages then. The Times says there were calls for another editor of the BBC's Newsnight to resign. In the Daily Mail, similar story. Nadine Dorries is not letting it spoil her fun. The Independent also leads with that victim apologising to Lord McAlpine. The Guardian says 5 family doctors have become millionaires this week. And in the Mirror, a tribute to Bill Tommy. That's all we have for tonight. Newsnight will be back on Monday, probably.